Good afternoon, Noetic listeners. This is Holly Holt. Today I'm actually discussing Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy wrote a great deal of poetry throughout his life, but didn't publish any until he was almost 60 years old. Instead, he was known for works like Far from the Madding Crowd and Test of the D'Urbervilles, both classics in their own right, one of which is actually on my reading list when I break from college in December. Despite how well known he is in the literary world, he started out as an architect who had other career plans. Though his occupation as an architect for PerBritannica.com brought Hardy both social and economic advancement, it was only in the mid-1860s that lack of funds and declining religious faith forced him to abandon his early ambitions of a university education and eventual ordination as an Anglican priest. His habits of intensive private study were then redirected toward the reading of the poetry and the systematic development of his own poetic skills. The verses he wrote in the 1860s would emerge in revised form in later volumes, but when none of them achieved immediate publication, Hardy reluctantly returned to prose. Because he enjoyed poetry more than prose, it's actually evident throughout his fiction is the way he uses poetic devices. He spent a large chunk of his life, later years, writing verse, and in fact, published about 1,000 poems and 8 volumes of poetry between the late 1890s and until his death in 1928. Despite his best efforts, his poetry wasn't appreciated during his lifetime, which seems to be the case with many writers. His poetry, per the Poetry Foundation website, is frequently described as gloomy and bitter, and pays attention to the transcendent possibilities of sound, line, and breath, the musical aspects of language. The poem I've chosen today, Where They Lived, published in 1917, fits this description. However, I believe that poetry isn't like math. There isn't just one set answer. With that said, please keep this quote in mind as I proceed to analyze his poem. From Thomas Hardy himself, we color and mold according to the wants within us, whatever our eyes bring in. Without further ado, here's the poem. Where They Lived by Thomas Hardy. Disheveled leaves creep down upon that bank today, some green, some yellow, and some pale brown. The wet bents bob and sway. The once warm slippery turf is sodden, where we laughingly sat or lay. The summer house is gone, leaving a weedy space. The bushes that veiled it once have grown, gaunt trees that interlace, through whose lank limbs I see too clearly the nakedness of the place. And where hills of blue, blind drifts of vapor blow, and the names of former dwellers few, if any, people know. And instead of a voice that called, "Come in, dears," time calls, "Pass below." In this poem, we are presented a perspective of someone viewing a landscape after a time away. In the first verse, the use of the word disheveled reminds one that existence isn't predictable, and each day holds the power to mess you up even the most solid plans. The way the leaves creep down, in this sense, explains the slow, steady change of the world, unkempt because none can control it. Proceeding from this, there's a span of colors, almost like the scope of life itself. When we are green, everything is new to us. When yellow, everything is bright with the potential for lasting, and we feel in control, radiant, and powerful like the sun. And everything's pale brown when we have aged, content with the scope of time we considered ours, yet We know soon we must return to the earth. The last two lines, the once warm, slippery turf is sodden, where we laughingly sat or lay, makes the heart place a heavy weight on the word once. The word itself says, never again, as the time for youth, for warmth, for laughter in this particular location is over. And the poet has therefore begun his description of a time gone by. In the second verse, the poet expresses how the place is naked, because of all that has gone that once made the place seem so alive. The summer house is the only semblance of human life in this verse. A weedy space has taken over where the summer house once stood. The bushes, beyond the tending of a steady hand, have grown, and gaunt trees allow for just enough space to show the poet nothing human exists there. In this familiar place where laughter once resounded anymore. Nature and time have taken their course and brought an end to the reign of human living. What I enjoy in this verse is the hauntingly human qualities nature has taken on. Words like gaunt and lank limbs and nakedness all serve to paint this picture. You can tell from this verse that the poet feels that the landscape is starving because he feels that way, without the familiar surroundings to welcome him. We are given a solemn page from his soul, and it is from there where he is hungry for what is no more. In the final verse, I feel we are met with a sense of finality. For example, in the first verse, there was mention of former laughter. In the next, former living arrangements. And in the last verse, the reason why everything is referred to as former in the other two verses. Because those who once lived and laughed are no more. Instead, we are given here a sense of what once was. Blue hills, to refer back to the landscape, and people who lovingly called to one another, and had such an influence over the shape of the landscape. All of that is taken away by time. By knowing what has become of these people, who others may or may not know, but the poet does. Else he wouldn't have so many fond memories of the place. Now, before the listeners get too gloomy, I want you to refer back to the quote I actually asked you to keep in mind. We color and mold according to the wants within us, whatever our eyes bring in. There's always another way to look at the passing of time, even if this poet is known to be gloomy and bitter. When I was reading this poem, I was taking into consideration my childhood home. Much like the summer house, the house where I grew up is no more. Yet, remembering laughter or letting tears set themselves free from time to time, because memories hold that power even in the strongest mind, isn't a weakness, nor should they make us become gloomy and bitter. Memory is a good thing. Memory exists so we don't forget how to hold someone when they're broken, or comfort them through hard times, or share a laugh for one of those random moments in life that weren't funny when it happened, but are hilarious now. Memory lets us be human, and therefore be gentle with others and ourselves. Thomas Hardy brought in what he saw with his eyes. He saw time passing, was saddened that it did, and let the landscape break his heart and those of his readers. Yet, time passes for everyone. Time calls for everyone to one day pass below. Death is unavoidable. So my thought is, why weep about something you cannot control? There's no room to view the landscape and wish it wasn't changing, because stagnation itself holds the potential to mean no progress. After all, people shape the landscape. Some are even said to become it. Sorry. Neither of which is bad. I like to think that I fit the Thomas Hardy quote of persons with any weight of character carry, like planets, their atmosphere along with them in their orbits. Although I'm not always happy-go-lucky, my atmosphere involves being optimistic, viewing poetry, such as this one, with a touch of light, just as I do bad days and bad grades. I hope that I've encouraged Noetic's listeners to do the same, to see beauty where some only see darkness, to appreciate life and embrace yours fully, and not to fear memories or be crushed by the passing of time. Thank you.